Everyone in town thought the ranch sat too far out to be worth anything. A stretch of dirt roads, power lines humming over the fields, and a single wooden gate that creaked every time the wind shifted. But I had built my life out here, fence post by fence post, acre by acre. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't even easy. But it was mine. That's why the morning I walked out and saw the numbers on my electric meter spinning like a storm, I froze. Something wasn't right. The barn lights had been off all night. The water pumps hadn't been running. And yet the dial was racing, like someone was pulling from me. I remember standing there, the sun barely touching the horizon, asking myself one question I couldn't shake. Who's stealing from me? For a week I kept checking. Morning, evening, midnight. The numbers never slowed. I cut everything inside, lights, fans, even the fridge in the bunkhouse. But still, the current flowed like a vein bled dry. That's when I noticed the cable. A thick black cord running across the back of my property, almost hidden by weeds. And it didn't lead toward the highway or the co-op's pole. No, it ran straight across the fence line, right into Karen's house. Karen, the woman everyone in our community either feared, avoided, or quietly despised. She was the self-appointed queen of the HOA, even though my ranch wasn't part of it. She hated that. Hated that my land, my cattle, my home, stood just outside her little kingdom of manicured lawns and plastic smiles. And now she was stealing from me. I didn't confront her at first. I wanted proof. So I sat up late at night, watching. And sure enough, when her porch lights glowed brighter than ever, my own power flickered. When her air conditioner roared through the summer heat, my meter spun faster. And when her house glittered like a Christmas tree at midnight, my barn lights dimmed as if begging for mercy. But here's the part I'll never forget. I went into town one afternoon, stopped at the feed store, and ran into a neighbor. He leaned in close, lowered his voice, and said, "You losing power too? Karen's place has been glowing like Vegas lately." That's when I knew it wasn't just me. She wasn't just stealing from my ranch. She was draining the whole neighborhood, and no one dared say a word. I drove home that evening with the windows down, dust trailing behind me, my hands clenched around the steering wheel. Every mile I felt the weight pressing harder. If I confronted her alone, she'd twist it. She always did. She'd smile, play innocent, make me the villain, and people would believe her. Because that's what Karen did best. She could hide behind that HOA title like a shield. Pretend she was protecting the community when really she was feeding off it. So I waited, planned, and then I made a call not to her, not to the HOA board, to the sheriff. And when I told him what I'd found, there was silence on the other end of the line. Heavy, long, deliberate. Then he said words I never expected. "You're not the first to bring this up." That silence after, it was the kind that stays in your bones. Because in that moment, I realized this wasn't just about stolen electricity. This was about Karen, about power, about control, and about how far she was willing to go to keep it. And the sheriff's next words would change everything. The sheriff didn't come that night. He didn't even come the next morning. But sometimes silence is heavier than noise. I couldn't get his words out of my head. "You're not the first to bring this up." Not the first. Which meant Karen's reach had spread further than I thought. And yet no one had ever stopped her. Maybe they were scared. Maybe they thought it wasn't worth the fight, but I wasn't built to stay quiet. By the third day, a white patrol truck rolled up my dusty drive. The sheriff stepped out slow, hat tipped low, boots crunching on gravel. He didn't need to say a word. The look on his face told me this wasn't going to be simple. He asked me to walk him out back, to show him the line. We pushed through the dry weeds past the fence until we found it, the thick cable running like a black snake across my land. He crouched low, touched it, followed it with his eyes, and then he sighed. She buried it halfway, didn't even bother to hide it right. The anger in his voice was calm, too calm, the kind that comes from seeing this before, from knowing a pattern. I asked him what happens now, and he didn't answer right away. He just stood there looking at that cable, jaw tight, like he was measuring his words. Finally, he said, "We'll do this by the book, that way she can't twist it." Those words sat heavy in me, by the book, because if anyone could twist the truth, it was Karen. That evening, the sheriff drove up to her place. I stayed back, leaning on the fence post, watching from a distance. Her house stood on the hill like a castle, lights burning bright in every window, music drifting out into the warm air. She opened the door before he even knocked, smiling, waving like she'd been expecting company. I couldn't hear every word, but I didn't need to. The sheriff's tone was steady. Karen's was sharp, rising, laughing in disbelief. She even threw her hands up once, pointing toward my ranch like I was the problem. And then she did what Karen always did best. She performed. Loud enough for neighbors to hear, dramatic enough for sympathy. She clutched her chest, shook her head, gasped like the very idea was an insult. But the sheriff didn't flinch. He just kept his hands on his belt, calm, letting her rant until her voice cracked. Then, finally, he pointed toward the cable. I'll never forget how fast her face changed. The smile vanished. Her eyes narrowed, lips pressed tight, and for the first time I saw it, the crack in her armor. She knew she was caught. But Karen didn't back down, not her. She leaned in close, whispered something to him. I couldn't hear it, but I saw his jaw clench. And when he stepped back, tipped his hat, and walked away, I felt the dread rise in my chest. Because she didn't look defeated, she looked smug. Later that night, when the sheriff called me, his voice was low. She's not going to stop easy. We'll need more than just a cable to shut her down. More than just a cable. I lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling fan that barely spun because the current was drained. And the questions started circling. How long had she been doing this? How much had she stolen? And what would she do now that she'd been caught? The next morning, I got my answer. I stepped outside, coffee steaming in my hand, and saw 3 trucks parked at her house. Men in ties, clipboards in hand, walking the property. Inspectors. HOA board members, her people. She was moving first, trying to cover herself to spin the story. And when one of them turned, looking straight at my ranch, shaking his head, I realized the war had already started. Because Karen wasn't just stealing electricity anymore. She was stealing the truth. They came onto my land the very next day. Clipboards, pressed shirts, and polished shoes stepping over the dirt like it didn't belong to them. 3 men, 2 women, all from Karen's HOA board. They weren't supposed to be here. My ranch wasn't part of their community, and they knew it. But Karen knew something else. If she brought them here, if she made it look official, the story could change. The tallest man, gray suit, sunglasses, walked straight up to my porch. Didn't even ask permission. He started with a question that wasn't really a question. We've had complaints about your wiring, dangerous connections, unsafe for the neighborhood. Unsafe? I laughed under my breath because I knew exactly what this was. Karen had flipped the story. She was the one who stole, and now she was painting me as the threat. I told them plain and simple, my ranch wasn't in their jurisdiction. They had no right to be here. But the man only smirked, tilted his sunglasses down, and said words that felt like a knife. Then maybe we'll need to involve the county. Unsafe power can get shut down fast. I wanted to slam the door, but I didn't, because this was exactly what Karen wanted, for me to lose my temper to prove her story. Instead, I stood silent, watched them scribble notes they'd already written before they came. And as they left, Karen stepped out onto her porch across the road, holding a glass of iced tea, smiling like a queen watching her army march. That smile burned in me all night. I called the sheriff again, told him what they'd said, what they were doing. He stayed quiet at first, then finally asked, "Did they cross your fence line?" I said yes. That's when his tone changed. "Good, then we've got trespass. And if she's staging this through the HOA, that means intent. Give me time, let me set this right." Those words gave me hope, but hope doesn't stop the lights from dimming. It doesn't stop the fridge from humming low or the water pump from sputtering when the cattle need it most. Every hour I felt her stealing, and every hour I wondered how long I could take it. Then came the letter. Folded neat, slipped under my gate. No signature, no return address, but the words screamed her name. Remove the illegal line connected to our property immediately, or face legal action. Illegal line. She was framing me, saying I had tied into her house. And if anyone believed it, I'd be the one in cuffs. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with the letter in my hand, the light above me flickering, and I realized something. This wasn't just a fight for money, not even for electricity. This was Karen trying to take control of my life, my land, my name. And if I didn't fight back smart, I'd lose everything. The sheriff came by 2 days later, not in uniform, not in his patrol truck. Just an old pickup, plain clothes, hat pulled low. He didn't step inside, just leaned against the hood and nodded toward the fence. "She's setting you up, that much I know. But here's the thing," he paused, chewing on the words. "If we cut that line now, it's just your word against hers. But if we wait, if we let her keep draining, you'll have more than a cable. You'll have evidence she can't spin." I stared at him, confused. Evidence? He explained it quiet, careful. They'd been watching her for weeks. Complaints had piled up, neighbors losing power, bills shooting high, but no one had proof. She was careful, always careful, until now. "Your ranch may be the key." She got greedy, and greedy people slip. The plan was simple but risky. Wait. Let her take more, document everything. Every surge, every flicker, every drain. The more she stole, the heavier the weight of proof would fall on her. It made sense, but it also meant nights of darkness, days of strain, watching my own home suffer while hers glowed brighter than ever. I agreed, because sometimes the hardest part of fighting back isn't swinging, it's standing still. And while Karen thought she was winning, the trap was already tightening around her. The sheriff came back after dark. No patrol truck, no lights, just the crunch of gravel under old tires. He carried a box in his arms, wires, small cameras, a device that looked like it belonged more to an electrician than a lawman. He set it down on my porch and said only 2 words, "We watch." I led him out to the fence line, the cable still running across like a scar in the earth. He moved quiet, steady, placing a small sensor near the line, tucking it beneath weeds, then another at the meter. Each one linked to a device in his hand, blinking green. Every surge, every pull, this will log it. No arguments, no lies, just numbers. I stood there watching his hands work, and for the first time in weeks I felt something shift, like the balance was tipping, if only a little. But Karen didn't slow down. The next morning her sprinklers roared while mine sat dry. Her lights burned in every window while I poured water by hand for the cattle. She didn't even try to hide it anymore. She was flaunting it. And worse, she began spreading whispers. Neighbors at the feed store pulled me aside, their voices low. "Karen says you tapped into her panel. She's talking fines, talking lawsuits." Each word stung, because that's what she wanted, to make me the suspect, the criminal, the man too stubborn to follow the rules. I came home one evening to find a fresh sign nailed to my fence. "Unsafe property reported." Red paint, bold letters. She wanted everyone driving by to see it. My blood boiled, but I didn't pull it down, not yet. Because the sheriff's words stayed in my head. We wait, we let her take more. And she did. At night, my barn lights would flicker so faint I could see stars through the rafters. My pump struggled to pull water. The cattle moaned low, restless, as if they could feel the strain too. I walked through those fields with a lantern, fists clenched, whispering to myself just to keep calm. Hold on, just hold on. Then came the storm. One night, thunder cracked over the hills. Rain poured down in sheets, lightning flashing across the sky. Power lines shook in the wind, and every house on the ridge dimmed, every house except Karen's. Her place shone like a beacon, bright, unyielding, almost mocking. I stood at my window, soaked from running in, watching her lights burn while mine sputtered. And something inside me broke. I wanted to cut the line myself, to storm across that field with shears and end it right there. But as I reached for my coat, headlights swung up my drive. The sheriff. He stepped inside, water dripping from his hat, holding the device he'd set days earlier. He set it on my table. Numbers glowed across the screen. "She pulled triple during the storm. Your whole system's bleeding into hers." "Triple?" He looked at me, voice steady but sharp. "This is it. One more night, then we move." The words echoed in the storm. One more night. I barely slept. I sat by the window, lantern dim beside me, watching her house across the ridge. Bright, defiant, her silhouette in the window, moving from room to room, untouched by the storm. And in that silence, I realized something deeper. Karen wasn't just stealing electricity. She was stealing dignity. Every flicker in my house was her way of saying she owned me, that she could take without consequence, that no one would stop her. But she was wrong. Because while she burned her lights brighter than ever, the sheriff's trap was already closing. And soon the whole town would see it. The storm passed, but the air didn't clear. It hung heavy, damp, charged, like the sky itself was waiting. The sheriff came back the next morning, this time in uniform. His boots hit the porch harder, his shoulders straighter, his voice sharper. It's time. He didn't have to explain. I knew what he meant. The evidence was logged, the numbers undeniable. And now it wasn't just about me, it was about the whole community she'd drained. But before we moved, he made me a promise. We won't do this behind closed doors. She thrives in whispers, in twisting stories. We'll end it where everyone can see. I nodded because that was the only way. Karen lived on performance, on neighbors' eyes, and if she was going to fall, it had to be on the same stage. Word spread quiet like smoke through dry grass, not shouted, not posted, just murmured. Sheriff's got something. Karen's name came up. Might want to be home tomorrow evening. By sundown, I noticed more trucks than usual parked along the ridge. Neighbors leaning on tailgates, conversations hushed. It wasn't a crowd yet, but it was a start. People had been waiting, maybe longer than I knew. Karen, though, she didn't flinch. She threw a barbecue. Smoke rolled from her grill, laughter spilled from her porch. Music played loud enough to echo through the valley. Lights blazed in every window, brighter than I'd ever seen. It was a show, a message. I stood on my porch in the dim light, watching her raise a glass with that smug grin, her guests clapping at jokes I couldn't hear. Every laugh sounded like it was aimed straight at me. But she didn't know what was coming. The sheriff spent the day preparing. He visited houses up and down the road, speaking to neighbors one by one. I saw heads nod, faces tighten, hands shake. Folks who'd been silent for too long finally finding a voice. By nightfall, I realized this wasn't just about Karen anymore. It was about all of us. Because she hadn't only stolen from me, she stolen from them power, money, peace of mind. And each of them carried their own story, their own scar. One neighbor told me later his kids' homework nights were ruined when the lights dimmed. Another said her husband's medical equipment had faltered during a surge, but none of them had dared point a finger, not until now. The sheriff knew that, and that's why he wanted them there. The plan was simple: gather at Karen's, show her the evidence, let her deny it, and then let the truth speak louder than her words. But nothing about Karen was ever simple. The next morning, a knock rattled my door. I opened it to find one of her board members, the man in the gray suit, sunglasses still on even in the early light. He held a folder, pressed it into my chest, and whispered, "Last chance. Drop this, or it won't just be about electricity." I stared at him, trying to read what that meant. A threat, a warning, or just another attempt to scare me silent. He smirked when I didn't answer, turned, and walked back to his shiny black car. I closed the door, leaned against it, and felt the weight of everything pressing down. But then I thought about the sheriff's words. She thrives in whispers. Not this time. That evening, as the sun dipped low, neighbors gathered along the road. Trucks lined the fields, people stepping out with arms folded, eyes fixed on Karen's glowing house. The sheriff stood tall, clipboard in hand, radio on his shoulder. And I felt my heart pounding because this was it. The stage was set. But Karen wasn't worried. She stepped onto her porch in a bright dress, glass raised high, her voice carrying across the ridge. "Look at this, the sheriff himself coming to enjoy the party." Her guests laughed, clapped, even cheered. She was still in control, still the queen of her little kingdom. Until the sheriff raised his hand. And the crowd quieted. He looked at her, voice steady but sharp. "Karen, we need to talk in front of everyone." For the first time, I saw her hesitate, just for a second. Her smile flickered. Then it returned, wider, brighter, dripping with false confidence. She leaned on the porch rail, tilted her head, and said, "By all means, Sheriff, entertain us." And that's when he opened the folder. Inside were numbers, dates, readings logged hour by hour. Each surge marked, each pull traced, each theft documented beyond denial. He read them out loud, slow and clear, the words rolling across the crowd like thunder. And as he spoke, the whispers started, neighbors glancing at each other, nodding, frowning, arms tightening. The truth was no longer mine alone. It belonged to everyone. Karen tried to laugh it off, tried to raise her voice over his, but each number, each fact cut through her words like a blade. And when the sheriff finally held up the device, the sensor that had logged it all, the crowd erupted. Because there was no spinning that. No smile, no story, no performance could undo what everyone could see with their own eyes. Karen's house wasn't glowing anymore, it was burning her. Karen didn't fall quietly, not her style. As the sheriff read the numbers, her smile began to twitch, her hands clenching the porch rail. But she didn't admit anything. Instead, she yelled, called out the sheriff, called out me, even called out the neighbors. Her voice was loud, sharp, and dripping with accusation. "This is ridiculous. He's lying. My electricity, my house is perfectly fine." The sheriff didn't flinch. His gaze stayed locked on her, voice calm, measured. "These numbers don't lie. Every spike, every pull, your property, your house, your consumption documented. This isn't about opinion, it's fact." Karen's eyes darted. Her guests shuffled, glancing at each other nervously. The laughter she had relied on moments before started to fade. Whispers grew. Questions began forming in the crowd. Is she telling the truth? Why would she do that? It was like watching a storm gather. She tried another tactic, a distraction. She pointed at the sheriff's truck. "Look, he's exaggerating. Those meters aren't calibrated. That's tampered evidence." The sheriff shook his head. "Every device is verified, every reading backed. You can challenge the methods later. Right now, we're here to protect the community from theft and unsafe practices. You've been caught." "Caught?" The word echoed, bouncing off the hills. It didn't just hit her. It hit everyone who had been watching, listening, wondering in silence. Karen's voice rose again, this time trembling slightly, as though the weight of all eyes was finally pressing down on her. I don't understand. I've always been." She faltered, the carefully constructed performance unraveling. Neighbors stepped closer. Murmurs turned to low voices, conversations breaking into fragmented sentences. "I knew something was off. Our bills, they were too high. She's been lying." Her guests began looking at her differently. Confused, hesitant, questioning. The energy shifted. She was no longer in control. She was being dissected, piece by numbers, witnesses, and now the crowd. And that's when desperation fully took hold. She started shouting names, accusing board members of bias, claiming vendettas. She demanded lawyers, demanded to speak alone, demanded anything that might slow the collapse. But it was too late. The sheriff lifted a hand, signaling something behind him. I hadn't noticed at first. The cameras, the sensors, the quiet logging devices, all now flashing softly, recording every flicker, every surge, every word. Evidence she couldn't argue with. She pounded her fists against the railing, voice cracking, tears welling up. But they weren't tears of innocence. They were the tears of a woman losing the illusion she had built her life around. The crowd murmured louder. People began stepping closer to the fence, asking questions, nodding toward the sensors. Children peered from pickup beds, adults exchanging stories of flickering lights, surges, strange bills. The sheriff looked at me, one word, watch. I watched as Karen's empire of control, the porch, the party, the music, the lights, began to crumble in real time. The neighbors who had once looked the other way now whispered truths to one another. And the weight of it all pressed down on Karen, heavier than any storm, stronger than any electricity she'd stolen. She tried one last desperate move. She reached toward the main breaker box visible from the porch, as if she could cut the evidence before it was seen. But a quick hand from one of the sheriff's deputies stopped her. Firm, unyielding, no arguing, no resistance. And then silence fell. Not a loud silence, but the kind that holds attention, that freezes movement. People stared. Corinne's chest heaved. Her hands dropped. Her eyes darted between neighbors, the sheriff, and me. She was exposed completely. The sheriff's voice cut through the quiet. Corinne, you have been stealing electricity from multiple properties, including this one outside of your HOA's jurisdiction. This is not a civil dispute, it's theft, and it's unsafe. You will be held accountable. The words hit like a hammer. Her house no longer glowed with triumph. The lights dimmed under the scrutiny of the crowd, under the truth finally laid bare. Her guests shuffled uncomfortably, whispers breaking into acknowledgement. She looked around, searching for an ally, found none. And in that moment, I realized something that had been simmering all along. Corinne's power never came from her title, her money, or her house. It came from silence, from the fear she planted. But when everyone saw her for what she truly was, that power vanished. For the first time, I felt a strange calm. Relief, yes, but also something heavier. Justice was unfolding, but slowly, deliberately in front of everyone. And Corinne, she wasn't ready for it. Corinne's porch, once a throne, now felt like a stage trap. Every eye on her, every whisper, every camera silently recording. Her performance was crumbling faster than she could spin it. She tried to speak again, voice sharp, but it trembled. This isn't fair, you don't understand. The sheriff stepped forward, calm, unyielding. Fair has nothing to do with stealing from your neighbors. You've had warnings, you've been caught red-handed. It ends tonight. Her eyes darted to the crowd. Friends, or what she thought were friends, shifted uncomfortably. Some turned away. Others stared with disbelief, whispering accounts of her theft. Every lie she had told was unraveling, every smile she had faked now stripped from her face. She reached for her phone, probably planning to call someone high up in the HOA, someone who could shield her. But the sheriff stopped her with a raised hand, a quiet authority that brooked no argument. It's over, Corinne. And then he did something that changed everything. He gestured toward her house. Power down. From his pocket, a device connected to her electrical line, the one she had been siphoning from me and others, sent a clear signal. Her lights flickered once, twice, and then went dark, complete darkness. The silence was electric. The crowd gasped, some cheered quietly, some whispered incredulously. And Corinne, she froze, mouth open, hands trembling. The woman who had controlled and manipulated for years was suddenly powerless. Her guests tried to murmur, to explain, to defend her. But the evidence was irrefutable. The sheriff held up the monitoring device, flashing numbers and logs, every spike and pull recorded, every theft documented, every lie exposed. And when the neighbors finally stepped forward, voices strong, unified, it became undeniable. Stories poured out, lights dimmed during homework, water pumps faltered, bills soared. Corinne's theft had affected everyone, and now everyone knew. She tried one last desperate tactic. Tears, pleas, accusations, but the community had already seen the truth. The sheriff didn't move. He didn't need to. The law, the evidence, the eyes of the people all bore down on her like a weight she could no longer carry. The moral of her actions hung heavy in the night air. Greed, manipulation, and deceit could hold sway for a time, but only until the truth is seen, measured, and shared. Corinne slumped against her railing, defeated, watching neighbors she had once dismissed turn their backs or shake their heads. The queen of the HOA was no longer in command. Her authority, her aura, her control, all evaporated in the light of evidence and justice. The sheriff walked toward me, nodding slightly. We've got her on everything. The county will take over from here. I exhaled, the tension leaving my chest slowly. Relief, yes, but also a strange weight. Watching someone fall from that height, even someone like Corinne, is both justice and sorrow. The crowd began to disperse, some shaking my hand, others just nodding quietly as if acknowledging that truth had finally been restored. And through it all, Corinne stayed on the porch, silent, powerless, exposed. I looked back at my ranch. Lights steady, pumps humming, barn bright. Electricity running safely, fully in my control again. And I realized that what we had reclaimed wasn't just power. It was dignity, fairness, the right to live without fear of being taken advantage of by someone who thought their title made them untouchable. Karen had built her life on others' silence, and tonight, in front of the whole community, silence was broken. The lesson was clear. Control built on lies and theft can never withstand truth. As I turned back to the fields, the sheriff beside me, I understood something else. Karma wasn't just a word. It wasn't a story you tell someone else. It's the reckoning that comes when the world finally sees what you've done. And Karen had her reckoning. Her guests had left. Her lights stayed dark. Her porch, once a throne, now stood empty, an empty stage for a woman who had lost everything she had tried to steal. I walked back to my barn, running a hand over the fence post, looking at the stars that reflected in my quiet, steady land. The ranch was mine again, yes, but more than that, the community felt safe, respected, and seen. The balance had been restored. And for the first time in weeks, I slept without worry, knowing that truth, patience, and perseverance had won. Not with anger, not with retaliation, but with steady, undeniable evidence and a community ready to see it for themselves. Karen's chapter had ended. The story of justice, clarity, and reclaimed dignity was just beginning. The morning after, the ridge felt different. The sun rose slow, spilling golden light across the fields, highlighting the fence lines, the barns, the quiet power poles humming steadily with electricity that was finally mine again. No flickers, no surges, no fear, just the steady heartbeat of a ranch that had survived. Karen's house was dark, silent. The blinds drawn, doors locked. No porch laughter, no music, no smoke curling from the grill. It was a hollow shell, a monument to what happens when greed and control go unchecked. And somehow, standing there, watching it from a distance, I felt relieved, yes, but also strangely sad. Not for her, not really, but for what she had lost, not just power, but trust, community, respect. All the things she could have had if she'd chosen differently. Neighbors came by throughout the day, some bringing coffee, others just nodding or offering a quiet smile. One by one, they shared their own stories of what Karen's theft had done, hours of lost work, spoiled meals, tense arguments over bills, the silent dread of wondering why the lights dimmed or the water pumps failed. And now, for the first time, they could speak freely, knowing the truth was on their side. I walked along the fence line, checking meters, making sure everything ran as it should. The sheriff had left instructions: keep an eye on things, maintain the logs, and call if any irregularity appeared. But I knew deep down it wasn't going to happen again. Not after what everyone had witnessed. Not after the evidence, the public exposure, the undeniable truth. And yet the real victory wasn't the electricity, or the meters, or even Karen's humiliation. It was the restoration of dignity, mine, my family's, my neighbors'. It was the return of trust in a community where fear had once ruled. That quiet, subtle thing we all take for granted until it's stolen, peace of mind. I went back inside the ranch house and poured a cup of coffee, sitting by the window, watching the morning unfold. Cattle grazing, the wind moving the tall grass, sunlight dancing across the barn roof. Life, uninterrupted, thriving under honest hands. A knock on the door pulled me from the moment. One of the neighbors stood there holding a small bundle of letters, thank yous, congratulations, even a couple of baked goods for standing strong. Smiles, gratitude, and quiet words of acknowledgement. You did what no one else would, one neighbor said softly. I shook my head, feeling both humbled and proud. We did it together, I said, and that was the truth. Word spread quickly. The HOA board couldn't hide it, couldn't spin it. Karen's theft, her lies, her control, they were all laid bare. Some board members resigned quietly, ashamed of their complicity. Others tried to defend her, but it was too late. The community had already seen. For my part, I didn't gloat. There was no need. The justice had been served, and karma had done its work. Weeks later, the sheriff stopped by one final time. He tipped his hat, glanced over the fields, and said simply, "Good work. She won't be back, not like that." I nodded. I didn't need more explanation. I already knew. Karen's era of control had ended. The ranch, the community, and the simple dignity of living without fear, all had been restored. That night, I stepped outside once more, lantern in hand, walking along the fence. Stars reflected in the quiet, steady land. The breeze carried the scent of hay and earth, a smell of resilience, endurance, and reclaimed peace. And for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to truly breathe. Sometimes the strongest battles are the quiet ones, the ones fought not with anger or violence, but with patience, evidence, and the courage to wait for the truth to shine. Karen had tried to steal more than electricity. She had tried to steal our confidence, our safety, our voice. And yet when the truth came, it didn't just restore what she had taken, it amplified it. I looked across the field toward her darkened house one last time. A lesson had been learned. A warning had been delivered. And the community had been reminded of something vital, that dignity doesn't come from titles, money, or appearances. It comes from honesty, integrity, and standing firm when it matters most. As the ranch lights glowed steady for the first time in weeks, I smiled, knowing we had won more than a battle over power lines. We had won peace. And in the quiet of that night under the stars, I felt the satisfaction of justice done, karma fulfilled, and a life reclaimed. Karen's chapter had ended, but our story of resilience, courage, and standing up for what's right would echo through this land for years to come. And as I closed the door, the steady hum of electricity in the background, I realized something. Sometimes the strongest victories aren't loud. They're quiet. They're enduring. They're undeniable. And this victory was ours. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one. The truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.